He talks about Adam. Let's say the human being, the creature, born of woman, is short-lived and sated with trouble. Right? So there's this emphasis on creaturehood, naturalness, mortality. We want to get that back in our head even after we've gone through chapter 28 and all of this other, because if we don't remind ourselves that all of this is coming from our broken need for understanding. He blossoms like a flower and withers, or the person blossoms like a flower and withers and vanishes like a shadow and does not endure. Right? The emphasis on the finitude of the self. The self wants answers because the self can't wait for some other reality. The self wants explanation in the hic et nunc, in the here and now. Right? In other words, meaning can't be deferred to some other kind of eschatological realm, or even to say that it will be deferred. The pain is now, and Job is saying, I need an explanation now. I'm born of a mother, and I will die. Right? So he blossoms like a flower and withers. So do you fix your gaze on such a one? What is the relationship between divine power that's infinite in magnitude and the mortal self that wants understanding? So we already see a kind of vast rupture in the two different levels, but it's still poised from the point of view of the desire for understanding. Right? The whole book will be this desire for understanding that wants to go on. Who can produce a clean thing out of an unclean one? No one. In other words, in a certain sense, he is modifying the statement of Elihu. The self, being mortal, is stained. In Ricoeur's terms, is fallible. The starting point is the fallibility and the stain and the imperfection of the self. So if that's the beginning confession of who a person is with a minimum amount of self-knowledge, that you can't escape that cognitive or emotional structure, that would change, or would it change, the theological issue? God, his days are determined, right? So already, because I'm going to anticipate what I'm coming to, there's a measure to human life, but there's no measure to the divine mind or power. And that produces initially a theological disjunction, right? You, God, know the number of his months. You have set him limits that he cannot pass. Turn away from him that he may be at ease until, like a hireling, he finishes his day. So to get back to this raw aspect of the theological claim of Job, there is this issue of finitude and infinitude, the human measure and divine measure. Or at least from the theological presumptions that are coming on here, there's the issue of stain infallibility and radical absolute totality of God. God knows. Right? He has set limits. So the question that now comes from the lonely cry, this cri de coeur, this kind of cry of the soul, is he doesn't see the relationship between power and ethics in God, and he is making an appeal to divine wisdom for compassion. Right? Wouldn't that be, from the point of view of Job, the proper response of a God of absolute totality and power, who knows the creature that God has created? So that's a new stance that he has. And now notice. So we already see that there's a first sense of looking inward to the body, theology always will begin with that level of reflection of the body on the earth, right? Insofar as we're talking about the natural self that's trying to find, as I'm going to talk about in a moment, a standpoint, right? Some kind of an Archimedean point. I'm going to come back to this notion. Some kind of a fixed point from which you can think and make an evaluation. So before we get to the radical dislocation that will happen in chapter 38, the notion of location of the self is emphasized as in theological terms. What is the location of the self? Body, imperfection, fallibility, desire, within a framework that should take that into account, right? That is, so in a certain sense, it's bordering on this question, can you serve God for naught? But now the question is being shifted theologically. Can God, God is obviously a creator with knowledge and power, but we haven't asked whether God can have compassion, can back off, can have an understanding of the creature that God has created, right? The fallible will that can never fulfill this because of the fallible will, right? And now notice that theology also doesn't just think out of the body, it has to think through correlations. It wants to think in relations. So the first relationship is my mind, my thought, my awareness of fallibility. But the deeper correlation is to look at the world of nature. And then he makes a quite remarkable analogical leap. The analogical leap that you would have expected is that animals die, trees decay, nothing on the earth is permanent. But now he shifts to what we might call the radical finitude of temporality towards the cycles of nature. Right? So he said, I'm not like a tree. There is hope for a tree. Right? Ki yesh la'etz tikva. Even trees have hope. Not me. Even trees have hope. There's a radical personification of nature here. Why does a tree have hope? If it is cut down, it will renew itself. Its shoots will not cease. If its roots are old in the ground and its stump dies in the ground, at the scent of water it will bud and produce branches like a sapling. It's an astonishing statement, right? There is a cycle of nature. There is the notion that nature renews itself. You, God, have done that. You've given more hope to a tree that has a certain level of cognizance, that is sentient in a kind of a primitive way, than the sentient being who could actually acknowledge you. Right? Nature doesn't acknowledge God, even though Psalm 19 would like to say that. The heavens declare the glory of God. But nature is mute. But nature has hope. Right? Notice this radical new theological issue. And the sentient self that could acknowledge God or knows creaturehood and godhood, which a tree doesn't. The tree just pulses. Right? And that is its prayer to God, right? It's a kind of a ongoing cycle of celebrating God as creator in this ceaseless way. The heavens declare the glory of God. That's what the tree declares, the glory of God, right? Nature is unending and it renews itself. But the self is not immortal. The self is fragmented, but the self thinks. But mortals, verse 10, mortals languish and die. The Hebrew, v'gever yamut v'yechalash. It's v'yigva adam v'ayo. It's a little bit stronger than here. It's JPS. A man dies. Verse 10. A mortal's languish and die. Man expires. Where is he? It's stronger in the Hebrew. But over against the tree. But a human being is fallible and dies and is chalash, has fallibility, simply has mortal flesh that wastes into the ground. That doesn't then, it may produce new trees, but the flesh in the earth doesn't produce a new person. Right? From Job's point of view. Right? That's what he's saying. He's trying to say this as an appeal to God. To, hey, God, God, it's not my problem. You've got a problem of your orientation. Vayigva adam vayayo. And when the person dies, that's it. There is nothingness. Where is he? He's not a seed that rejuvenates. Right? Now, feel what he's saying. Right? Feel what this is as a human statement that we all understand so deeply. Right? And then he goes on to say, waters of the sea fail, the rivers dry up. So a person lies down never to rise. He will awake only when the heavens are no more. Okay? So we're not in any kind of... There's no consolation of resurrection. Right? The question is, what is the consolation of the mortal person doomed to die? Right? In the sense of Boetis. What is the consolation of philosophy? What's the consolation of thought? What's the consolation of this kind of awareness? Right? Would it not be just a more limited, harmonious existence before the end? Right? That's part of what he's saying. 14. If a person dies, can he live again? And he says, if you would call, I would answer you. So, in a certain sense, he's making this further claim, which we all know from I will continue to protest. All that the self has in this framework of dire mortality is some desire for comprehension and integrity within the capacity of mind. Right? God hasn't said, I've given you this, defer this, trust in me, it's all going to be fine. Right? It's a radical, natural position of this theological issue, and all the self has is this total awareness, at least as much as a person can be aware. He's not denying the facticity of death. He's not denying the facticity of limitation. He's not denying the fact that it's being a sinner, but he's not calling it being a sin. It's just being stained. In the sense, not of sin so much, but stain means I'm aware that I'm never quite homologous with it, right? There's just something off. There's just something off all the time. So my life has a kind of stain. Maybe it's not the exact, because I don't want to imply sin in this particular case. But there is a slight dislocation between the yearning for perfected accomplishment, not even to fulfill God's word, but perfected accomplishment, and the incapacity ever to do that fully. That one is ruptured from within so that nothing is ever absolutely the right way. So he's not denying any of that, but all he has is that, the honesty of that assertion. And he's saying to God, you know better than I what it means to be a person, so give me space. You're a helicopter god, right? Give me some space to breathe, or he says to swallow my spittle. He says it in other places, right? In chapter 5 or 6. I don't have time, space even to swallow, because I'm rushing to the next thing that the self needs to do. So, anybody want to comment just on that, and then I want to kind of broaden this to make some other theological comments as we move towards chapter 38. Yeah.
What does he mean when he says, he will awake only when the heavens are no more? That does seem to imply some kind of awakening at some point.
So what verse are we at? What verse is it?
Verse also, man lies down never to rise, he will awake only when the heavens are no more, only then be aroused from his sleep.
I wouldn't read it that way. I think that Hebrew translation has pushed towards the use of that verb in the end of Daniel, where it implies a resurrected awakening. In the context of the text, it's a negative. I would read it this way. The ish shachav, a human being dies into the earth, v'lo yakum. There is no renewal in the sense the way there are with trees. There's no resurrection of going beyond that. And then the parallel, and then I would read the second line, Ad bilti shamayim lo yakitu, even to the end of time, of the end of the heavens, he will not awaken.
JPS is
I think JPS has given us a Jewish resurrection theology in the translation. It's not that. I mean, you have to be very careful. I mean, that's at least the way I'm reading it in terms of the parallelism. It is a double negation, right? If a person lies into the ground, they will not arise. Ad bilti shamayim, even to the extent of the temporality of the heavens, lo yakitzu, that person cannot arise. Velo ye'oru mishnatam, and they will not awaken from their sleep. So, JPS, in its way, does what the NEB and the Jerusalem Bible, Jerusalem Bible and NEB, they correct according to Septuagint or subtleties of Christian theology. Here we have leaning on medieval commentators who are picking on this. That's not what it means. It's a deeper nihilistic statement. Otherwise, what is he saying with one hand? So thank you for pointing that out. So I radically disagree with that translation. I think it's cheap theology. In other words, it's bending back another theological position, which may be true for all we know, but it's bending it back into Job, right? So you have to, if you're going to read it that way, you have to read it with your eyes open, that that's not what the parallelism is saying, and that you're reading it with a later Jewish and Christian tradition, which may be the way a later stage read it, but I don't believe that that's the way the authorship of Job intended it.
My Christian translation is honest to the text.
Is what?
My Christian translation is being honest.
Be.
Translates as it is written.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. You mean the Russian translation? Yeah, okay.
Christian.
Yeah, okay. Okay. You have to be very careful. I don't want to get into the issues of translation. But, for example, if you look, in many cases, at the NEB, where there's a New English Bible, the Episcopal, the Church of England, or the Jerusalem Bible, when they have a problem in the text, they'll go back to the sacred interpretive or textual tradition and silently correct that in the translation. The Jewish Publication Society makes the pretension, it says, according to the Masoretic version. Okay, so that means you have the letters of the Masoretic version. But when they have a problem, they'll suddenly translate with Kimchi or Ibn Ezra, or one of the medievals, and not tell you that they're making a choice because the text is problematic. So I don't think the text is problematic. If you think I'm a heretic, that's your problem. Okay.
I also read there is another problem here we noticed in Christian theology. There is the reliance on Job and Psalms to argue for the original sin. Right? When he talks about the imperfection of the self. So what are the Jewish interpretation of these?
In the Hebrew Bible, there's the first hint of what we would say original or sin. It appears in 4th Ezra, and 4th Ezra is not necessarily a Jewish, or it's been marginalized as a Jewish text. I don't want to get into that, but I think we have to. What we really want to try to do at this stage is just to try to get this first order of significance. You're right. There's always an attempt to find precursors. I think it's a stretch to say that because he speaks of the fallibility of self, that he's talking about some original sin. He's talking about some sense of selfhood that is imperfect. That's different from an original sin, right? Right? And so, I mean, if I can understand that if I were a Christian, there would be a tendency to read this in the light of Romans 7 and to say that you can never fulfill the will and why, But this is a text that's before that, and I just want to at least try to keep that stratum clear. I can understand that if you want to read this in the context of a community of faith at a later point, you may do other kinds of things with it. And that would incorporate Job within a scriptural horizon that's part of one's theological universe. But let us try to see this in the first instance as not part of the biblical canon, or it's before the biblical canon, and it's before the rabbinic canon, it's before the Christian canon. It's simply in its first frame. I think I want to raise at the end of today's class what then it would mean to reinsert this back into a scriptural canon. But I don't think because you've got it within the space of covers or within your computer that you should assume that it is in the framework of a text. It was always in the framework of a canonical text. In the canon.
They talk about that gap, right, an existential gap, which reminds me very clearly of the Buddhist notion of dukkha, which is exactly that gap, that insufficiency, that impermanence that is there. But secondly, and you read that he begs God, give me space. Is it possible? You have two different natural theologies, before 28 and after 28.
Right.
And before 28, could you argue that he's indeed asking God to give him space, but maybe he's also asking God for a direct providence? He wants, because the book starts with him being in the midst of a well-oiled and well-working economy of sacrifice ritual, which seems to work for him, and that is dislocated and displaced, and then maybe he's trying to regain something of that, but also regain a centeredness as the human being the center of creation, let's put it that way. And then in 28, after 28, that natural theology will actually dislocate that even more radically.
I think let's keep that in mind, this issue of personal providence, general providence, whether there's a notion of natural generic order and particular. all of Job doesn't know this language of personal providence and general providence, but let's keep. But the issue of how the Creator attends to the world, insofar as the Creator attends to the world, right? And then what you can do. So what I want to actually, I want to spend a couple of minutes, 5-6 minutes before we get to 38, to kind of reframe what we've been doing again in theological terms, because the issue now is not simply issue of rhetoric and style and genre, but the class is on hermeneutical theology. So we want to keep that notion. So a fundamental feature from the very beginning is the quest of the theological self. Because Job, even from the very beginning, is a theological self. He wants to serve God. He's in a divine universe. It's the search for what I alluded to a moment ago as an Archimedean point. Is there a pivot point? Is there an axis point? Is there a point around which you can think? Something stable, right? Is there a point of order? Is there a point of significance? Is there a point of obedience that does it? What is the Archimedean point, right? We could say that in some cases, so we say the Archimedean point, put in different terms, is what is the measure around which he can order a meaningful theological existence? What is, or if we don't want to use the word measure, what is the foundation? Right? Later tradition might say that the foundation could be faith, or the foundation could be obedience to the divine will, to a scripture. Right? That would become a principle of ordering the mind, insofar as the mind could do that, but then that's already the gift of a divine to the human being. So what is the Archimedean point of order? What is the principle of significance and signification around which you can actually have a life that makes theological sense, insofar as the human being wants to have a life of some kind of coherence? What is the ratio, right? In the deepest sense, all theology, as Nietzsche understood, is based on the optimism of reason, right? The fundamental optimism that you can make sense. That's an optimistic stand towards the world. And part of the reason that the book of Job is so powerful, or it even appeals to us in what we might say a modern or postmodern situation, is that it pulls away the Archimedean point. It pulls away the sense of the confidence in a foundation. It pulls away the sense that we have a ratio with respect to religion. That there is a fixed point and not multiple points or any point, right? And that the human mind could somehow know that, right? What would be the basis of any optimism in life if we would say we know no measure? There is no principle of order that we can discern. It may exist, right? Right? I'm not sure I can remember the, maybe Maxim would remember. I think he's a Bulgarian, but he's a physicist. Is it Perigoni? Is that the physicist? He introduced the notion of radical uncertainty as a principle of physics. And he... No, but he raised the notion that uncertainty what happens when uncertainty is not simply an epistemological issue, but it's an ontological issue? Right? In other words, that it's not as if that there's enough that you can get your mind around, but when uncertainty... Well, yeah, that's it. From one side, that's the uncertainty principle of that. But I think it's Perigoni. He's anyway. He won the Nobel Prize around a certain principle of uncertainty many years ago. But the point that I simply want to put on the table right now is that it's not just certainty, but uncertainty from the theological or existential point of view or the religious point of view is not simply an epistemic issue. If I knew more, if I had a different perspective, if I could look at it from the top down. Can I ever look at it from the top down? If I could get out of my body and have an out-of-body experience, which is a sort of way of saying that God would give me a revelation so I could see it from another perspective, right? God would help me with my epistemic problem by helping me say, this is what you've got to do because I can see it better than you can see it, right? But if you say that uncertainty is an ontological issue, that's a different question. And we're going to have to ask that question whether the problem that Job raises is not just cognitive and epistemic, but it's ontological as well. And that puts the theological issue in a very different kind of frame. It doesn't mean that one can't live a theological and moral and spiritual life. It means that the notion of explanation has to totally change relative to that truth, if that's the truth. If the truth is a revealed will, well, then you've got a very clear axial point for obedience of faith, right? But it's very different if there is some hint of not knowing, right? So I want to just raise that right now because I want to come back when we get to the end of 38 and following to ask in a very different sense whether the movement in the book of Job is a different kind of negative theology, of a process of unknowing. Not a traditional form, but I'm going to come back to that.
Professor?
So, yeah.
I think we might address this in a little while, but I would like
Yeah.
to ask, maybe ahead of time, that if it's a radical unknowing and a radical sense of finitude, isn't that exactly kind of almost come full circle to the idea of the Almighty being in juxtaposition to that, and therefore that being the Archimedean point again?
If you knew that was the truth.
But
In other words,
isn't
he
like pretty certain here? He's like, well, yeah, I'm finite. I'm not like nature. I feel really small. I don't know anything. And then
So I think that the issue that we have to face is how do you integrate that shattering of the foundations, right? It's not simply whether those pieces of information are out there, and let's say you knew them like in the way that you knew the pieces of a puzzle, and you were able to put it together on Sunday morning real fast. So you knew the pieces, but the question is, if you integrate that in the most radical way, does that really change you? So it's a question of how do you integrate that shaking of the foundation, right? How do you integrate it? Not that you couldn't know it at different levels, but how do you integrate it? So I want to come back to that, but I think you're absolutely right, because we're always going to maybe have this sense of magnitude, but there can be lots of ways that you can hide behind that phrase, and then it doesn't change you. And for Job, it's going to change him. Whatever he knew, even if he knew all of this, the knowing will change him. And we have to try to understand how does the theological mind, the hermeneutics of change, of theological change, take place. So I wanted to just raise one more thing and talk about, we already introduced the notion of rupture, and I just want to say a word about it from a primary or a secondary point of view, right? So one is necessarily in a certain kind of theological universe, as Job is, at the primary level of what we would call ritual, right? So what ritual really does is it tries to put you into a kind of harmonious rhythm with things, right? What happens with ritual? What happens with rupture? Well, we saw with Job, the first sense of rupture is that maybe his kids don't think about it in the best way. So it's a question of closing up the cognitive gap, right? Right? It's a kind of sticking your finger in the dike, right? Right? So there is a rupture. It's a perceived rupture in the perfection of performance. So the thing to then do is to slam that hole shut somehow. He'll do it for them, right? Because the cognitive dissonance, that there could be any dissonance, is disastrous to his sense of cosmos, right? Rupture will always dislocate cosmos, even if it's the perception that, he's not an obsessive compulsive too much, but it's because there's a lot at stake. Ritual is a sacred act. So then there becomes something else besides a cognitive dislocation, or the ritual, that the difference between mind and body might be, there's a gap between mind and body, or intention, performance and intention, right? Right? Then there can be the issue of death as a rupture. And we saw that the first order of handling this radical issue of loss is through liturgy, not just closing the ritual gap, but through this verbal litany, which is very pious. And when we get the Kierkegaard, we'll see how powerfully he is able to read that. But then we get to a much deeper level, the issue that begins to emerge after chapter 3 and following, the notion of clarity of understanding, right? It's whether the mind can ever know or tries to know. So the theological task becomes in the space of cognitive dissonance, right? And so we move from the language of confession and liturgy to the language of human discourse and rhetoric and communication, to try to figure it out on the basis of human knowledge, of what people have been able to gather on the basis of experience. Right? No one is pointing to some kind of divine communication outside of that realm, right? They're trying to deal with it within that particular space. And then when we got to chapter 28, we saw it's the very unmaking of the ratio itself. Ratio was really going full guns, and then all of a sudden he says, you're spinning your wheels because the pit is just an ice thing, and your wheels are just going to go forever. There's no way that you can get traction. There's no cognitive traction within the framework of human chokhmah or the human ratio. So all that should be left is a disposition of wisdom. an awareness of reverence. Right? And as we move towards chapter 38, even that is radicalized. Because then we move not simply to the unmaking of the ratio, of the capacity of the mind to have any comprehension, but the unmaking of all comprehension. It's radicalized to the ultimate degree. So explanation becomes this issue. So let us turn now to 38, because the question that emerges is, how does theological form affect theological thinking? Right? How does the form affect like if ritual is one form, it affects it by one response. If liturgy is your thing, or reasoning, and you think that that would be a way to think theologically, all of these are broken apart. And now we have a different theological form, which is the aporetic question, the question that is unanswerable. Right? That's the form. And God is introducing that form. Can you think with this new form? Right? In other words, begin to think now of what this is from the point of view of hermeneutic theology. God is not saying to Job, read my scripture more carefully. He's not saying, reinterpret my words more suitably. Because if you do, it's already somehow inscribed there in a deep sense. And you can, it's inscrutable, but you can scrutinize it and you can get a new meaning. That's sort of the presumption of theological hermeneutics, if you're reading the text. That is a foundation. And you can build on it. Right? So, but he's not talking about the book of Scripture, he's talking about the book of nature. And he's asking him, in the first order, do you know how to read the book of nature? I'm the creator. Do you know how to read this? But he's not simply saying to Job, go out into the world from your location as a mortal being and read the world, not like a scientist, not trying to have explanations from a scientific, but reading the world from the point of view of meaning, right? Understanding. Not just what you could do with the world in terms of techne, but now what God is producing is this very strange semiotics. It's a new semantics. It's a semantics of images and questions. And and the interpretive task is, can you answer these units of significance and know their signification? I'm telling you, says God, this is not just a neutral semiotic. It's not just, I'm telling you that it has significance. Like each image, as it were, is a unit of significance in the world. Do you know the signification of this? Can your mind understand the fullness of the signification of these units of significance? Do you know? And not only can you, so we're reading, if we use that in a metaphorical sense, we're reading through a series of gestalten, right? There are these figurative images that are coming, which we'll take a look at a couple. And those become the sentences of significance, right? Can you read any one? He's not saying that they're symbolic, right? It's not a symbol. But they have signification. Do you know what it means to read that in a sense of a revelation to your consciousness? Right? That it reads you as much as you read it. Right? So God has created some, or the writer, and it's theological because it's a writer who is producing an attempt at theology. All of this is within the horizon of the human self, of whoever that writer is. It's not being presented as coming from divine inspiration or revealed to a writer. Right? So it is human theology of a very powerful sort. So in a certain sense, we have this kind of, at the one hand, it's oral, because he hears it. On the other hand, it's spectral because you see it as well. You see a sequence. It's both auditory and visual in a certain kind of way. And it is something addressed to the mind. And the question that God says is, not, do you know me? Do you know my will? Do you know my creation? Do you know my... He's saying, do you understand these things? That I, God, am the source of. Right? But that's all. So God is simultaneously creator and revealer in this way. He's revealing what the creation is. He's giving an image of the revelation in creation. That there is a revelation in creation, and do you know how to read that? Right? It's different from, do you know how to read your suffering? Do you know how to read your life in relationship to Scripture? It's a different kind of knowledge. So we see these questions which are aporias. And it begins with a certain kind of incomprehensible knowledge. Right? God is the asker. So what God is doing is He's revealing a new text to be decoded. But the decoding is posed through an endless series of unanswerable questions. This is a true aporia, right? Where were you when I established the earth? Tell me if you have any wisdom. Who established its dimensions, if you know? Or who stretched it out by a kind of plumb line? Right? These are the questions being addressed to Job. Alma, on what were its foundation principles fixed? Or who threw down the center, the center stone that gives everything its axial point? Right? The foundation stone of existence. That everything, in a sense, turns on this foundation point. It's a geometric physical image, but he's asking, were you there when the morning stars began to sing? And when they proclaimed, and all the heavenly beings proclaimed. Right? Verse 12. Did you ever, at any time in your life, command morning to arise? Tzivita boker. Do you know where dawn comes from? Right? Can you grab the hem of the earth? What is the dwelling place of light? Can you understand the storehouses of snow? Right? Have you ever entered it? What do you mean? How can you enter a storehouse of snow? Do you know why God, 25, 26, there's sometimes rain in the desert and the drought where people live? Right? Does rain have a father? And who gave birth to dewdrops? So the self, or can you tie onto the tail of Orion? Right? Do you know the laws of heaven? Not like a scientist, but you know the infinite structures that make up a being. You who are located, you who have perspective, that's a human perspective. You whose characteristic is locatedness. You who have a mind inside of a mortal head. Right? But he's asking it of the human being. Right? So the issue that's confronting the self is whether the self can answer. And does the self know that? Right? Do you know when these strange animals give birth and so on? And then I think one of the most powerful of the texts, I had mentioned it to another class, beginning in 39:13 and following. Now, I'm going to raise this because I want us to push what is being said to the self. God is making the theological claim, and the self has to give a theological answer with implications. So he says, do you know anything about ostriches? Right, in 13. Right? They have fancy plumage. They drop their eggs. They try to keep them warm. And then they're so unconscious and stupid, he says, that they walk away from their eggs or they step on them. And that's just the way ostriches ostrich. That's just the way they do it. or the way horses snort, or the way vultures eat other animals and look for them. That's just the way it is. And even these weird creatures of Behemoth and Leviathan, all out of proportion, right? Circus events, right? They're all out of proportion to anything, right? Primordial dinosaurs, whatever. The primordial. It's not even anything that fits into our sense of a created order. So at first case, Job says in chapter 40, Kaloti. So this is a different kind of a confession than in chapter 2. This is the first confession. Confronted with this revelation. It's a revelation to consciousness. I see things from a very thin perspective, kaloti. I don't have a depth perception. I see things in a very light, thin, superficial way. I'm just flighty. I'm just yadi samti lamopi. I stop up my mouth. I've spoken, and I won't speak anymore. So this first issue is this radical silencing of the desire to get the mind beyond its locatedness, because it's realizing that there are locations and significance that the mind can't even begin to understand, right? And then he goes on to say, and what is given to the self to know is simply the facticity of each of these created things. And they have their own good, right? The good of each thing is not the good that we would establish in moral, ethical terms. It is its own good. That's just the way it does its thing, right? So the taxonomy of creation is not the taxonomy of Genesis 1. There are orders of good, and that the human being fits into the order of good. There is not simply taxonomy, but infinite diversity. Right? That's, or we might say, the mystery is the infinity of excess, every bit of which is distinct and part of God, comes out of God's mouth as something that God has done. Right? From the singing angels to the vulture. That is all part of God's world. Right? That's part of what's being revealed to consciousness. Not what you have to do to fit in, but what your mind has to assimilate to be aware. Right? Or if we were to talk in contemporary theological terms, so there is no, what you wanted, Job, and your friends wanted, or Genesis 1 wants, is some totalizing of knowledge. That you can get your head around enough that gives you some kind of total understanding. And now we have this absolute fragmentation of multiplicity and possibility, which is not called good, it's just there. It's not called, none of this is called altogether good or the good. And it doesn't fit into any order that the mind would like to construct. It is just absolute plurality through the plurivocity of divine voicing of things into existence. So the mind has to come to a new knowledge, but not the knowledge like the old knowledge which knows and circumscribes things so that it thinks that it's like a God because it has a divine knowledge, right? It can get its head around something, not just techne, but what really is at stake, right? The space in which things happen, right? You can never get around that encompassing space, right? There's a sphere in which things happen, and your mind can never get around that in any total or thoughtful manner. You're within the same soup of absolute excess, absolute distinctiveness of everything, but for one difference. You're not an ostrich, and you're not a vulture, and you're not a horse. And he doesn't even talk about the human being, but the human being is addressed. The human being is not the center of creation, like in Genesis 1, but the human being is the only being to which this can be addressed. So if there's any distinction to the human being, is somehow to become aware. It's a knowledge of awareness, what we would call today mindfulness. But it's what the and it isn't a mindfulness that gets around the whole. It's a new kind of what it means to have a mind that is aware of this incomprehensible multiplicity. So I see your hand for a little bit, but the question is not yet. So the unknowing is: do you know this? Do you know that? No, obviously you don't know that. And what happens to the mind that can't answer all of that, but has to come to a new positivity? What is the positivity that arises from this negation? And he's not saying, do you know God? It's not a negative theology, do you know God? Do you know these things that I have done? But they're also at a different order than God's Godhood. God could be something totally else than what appears in this little corner of a universe. I think I just heard yesterday, it was just astonishing. There's some attempt that with some kind of a special laser, it would take 20 years to go, it would take 20 years to go through the 12 to the multiple trillion galaxies to where that thing has to get to. Right?
Where what?
Where that light beam is being shot. There are more than 1 trillion galaxies, and it would take, even to get to that point that they can imagine, 20 years at the speed of light. Right? Right? So, what are we talking about here? Right? Did you observe this commandment? like what, in heaven's name, are we talking about? Well, in Job's universe, he's asking that question. Right? I mean, do you think God does the same thing 20 years at light speed through a trillion galaxies towards whatever thing is out there that he does to us? If there is a God like that? What are we talking about here? This kind of theological megalomania that is not just the center of this theological universe, but it explains everything in totality. Right? Not just that it's not true for this order of being. It may be true for this order of being. Right? But that's part of what the book of Job, within its cognitive structure, is forcing us to say. You have a sense of vastness, but your vastness is limited by your imagination. And God is beyond that encompassing vastness. He's not saying anything about God. It's just God does these things in this awesome manner. So what does it mean to be a religious person in this Ekwelt, this little piece of planet, someplace in the cloud? That doesn't mean that you have to become nihilistic. I'm not making a nihilistic claim. I'm not saying that these theological truths cannot have actuality. We'll leave that for a second.
Which claim?
That we live in such an incomprehensible speck of cosmic existence. So I'm not making a nihilistic statement, and we still have to move forward to what kind of a theology you would live in. But the question is, what is the frame that the theological seeker has to absorb? At least what the book of Job is challenging you to. Right? Or if you make such claims of talking about a cosmic God, what are you talking about? You're talking about a cosmic God. Right? Cosmic God, a cosmic Christ. If you're Jewish. So we think we know, but that's a theological framing, right? Okay. And then there's this God, and then there's the God beyond this God that we can know about. It doesn't mean that the God that we know about doesn't reveal or doesn't make challenges, right? We'll get to that in a second. But there is some kind of Godding beyond God that's blessed on earth, perhaps. At least Job is making us think that by turning the mind inside out. That's what the questions are doing. There is an emptying of mind through the questions. And the question that I want to pick up on Logan's question, but the question that we're going to have to turn to, if the distinctiveness of the human being is to have that insight. It doesn't mean you know a hell of a lot, but you at least have that insight. And that insight is a radical negation of presumption. How do you go forward positively? What is the positive that's correlated with that negative? I'm not saying nihil, I'm saying that negative. So let's first have Logan and then Adrian, and then we'll move on. I'll try to give some kind of the answer within Job, not an answer. Yeah.
So then I just kind of wonder what we're to make of Job that making sacrifices for his three friends.
I want to talk about that at the end. Okay, I want to at least make a suggestion.
Because, at least what it seems to me that practically this new stance is kind of either you have a fear of God's destructive power, maybe now God's generative power, because you can't know all of these things that He created, but practically...
I think we might be going there, but I'm going to try to make another suggestion. Okay, but you're raising that issue. So what if you go on, what sense does it make? Or say, in what frame does sense make? or sense makes what sense in what sensible frame, right? Right?
I mean, I guess.
Right? So, is it nature? If you're Jewish, then you say, well, it's scripture, and no, then my frame is also the oral tradition. And if I'm a Christian, I say, no, I've got to go to the New Testament, that's the real frame. And no, it's not that, it's the church fathers. No, it's the East. No, it's the West. And then if I'm Muslim, I say, no, it's another frame. Right? And everybody's fighting about their frames. Right?
I guess the reason I just especially curious about this question is because in the beginning he makes sacrifices on behalf of his children, and those are not listed in the divine.
You're absolutely right. I think that there is an attempt to make you think about those things in correlation, and I think I want to come back to that. Or I want to try. You're right. So you're pointing out that the end is like the beginning, but is it? Is the mind the same? Adrian and Steve, okay.
I think one of the great achievements of the book is to move us away from this, like say, Nietzschean way reason is something that gives you, how did you put it, positive, this positive, negative, and I think the answer is there is a way to be without moving away from this. You are serving God for a reason.
Right.
There is no reason. You just have to do it with that sense of awareness, of limit, of avoiding hubris. And right.
All right. So you've added that issue. Does that issue, can you serve God chinam for no purpose? Can that come back with that new awareness? Right? Yeah. So I want to try to answer that, but you're right. In other words, if the book is trying to bring us through a series of changes of consciousness, then how do you go on with action? Right? Because part of our problem is the relation between thought and action. And if a certain form of thinking is radically dislocated, is there any legitimacy to action, or is it like kind of a Hefkerwelt? Is everything permitted?
So the radicality of the end is that this is the whole spiel is not about us, and we only understand just a little bit. So it's I think it helped me change my understanding of providence. That providence is not about me. It's not. Things just happen. Sometimes we understand why, sometimes we don't understand why. But this is it. It's a mechanism.
If we're talking providence in this sense, the providence is in every bit of it.
Right.
Because an ostrich wants to be an ostrich, so God helps the ostrich be an ostrich.
Right. So there is
right? It's not like that's a sport. God intended that to be, some kind of something else, but it accidentally became an ostrich, so God is not really concerned about it, right? God's pretty happy with ostriches ostriching, and animals eat other animals, and He helps them fulfill their animal thing. And sometimes animals go off the reservation; they eat people. Right, if you wander on. And human beings do stupid things, and there is no global warming, right? You make stupid statements. So, part of the issue is that I don't want to necessarily use the word providence. But the issue is what God is saying, that all of these things are part of the divine order.
Yes,
whatever,
right.
And order is simply the fact of each thing being its thing, which includes us who can think about that, and all the stupid things that we also do. Right? Or the capacity that we have we're not simply part of the order of things, we actually have a reflective consciousness. So that changes what it means to be a person as opposed to be a panther that's hungry. Right? Or a monkey that swings by its tail. Right? So that kind of an issue. So we don't have another language besides problem, but we have to say everything has its God-given destiny, its dimension, and that God-given dimension has itself all kinds of possibilities. Steve, and then you going to say something?
Yeah.
Okay. Then go back to Logan. Okay.
It seems to me that a theology of not knowing is a theology in itself. That I can accept the fact that my theology is that I can't know. At the same time, I can appreciate the wonder of not knowing and the wonder of creation, and the diversity. And that is an amazing change in Job. That I can go from a concept of the pride of knowing to the cognition of not knowing and appreciating the humanness of humanity as part of the creation concept, but it coupled with a concept that is beyond my ability to comprehend, and that's my theology. If I accept the fact that there's a God-created universe that I can't fully understand, but that my humanity requires me to use my consciousness to live my life, and I think there's another component to it, and that's the commonality of the human experience. That Job at the end is not alone. He sacrifices for his friends. So I think that inherent in that humanity concept is I'm not alone in realizing this world. There are other humans who are being humans like I am. And that cognition, along with the cognition of my insignificance and my inability to know, in my view, is the message of the book.
Okay, so we're pushing towards the end. I think I agree with you, but let's absolutely. And then we'll go back.
So is your point in the movie with the ostriches these kind of ugly forms of nature and creation? Fire?
They're wondrous, right? It's just wondrous, but not. They don't have the ethical.
Right. Is it? Just,
there's no ethical measure, right?
Or at least not an.
That we would know, right?
That we would know. But there is some.
What is the measure? The measure is each thing being itself. Thank God.
And so, I mean...
That's what the writer is saying. Thank God.
I guess I don't... I guess I can't really struggle with that. That's not...
All right, let's see. Let's see where we go. Let's see. And then I want to go back to the end of the text.
You juxtapose earlier between the book of nature and scripture. And my question is whether... I mean, if we had to understand scripture, theologically, and a different order of language, a type of language, which would seem limits, for example, nature, or that first primordial language, how would the tension be treated to carry out the fact that we still are attempting to understand the same type of language as the scripture in the light of the theological concept?
So the question, towards the back of the room, is that if we're dealing with the book of nature and the book of God or theology or whatever, they have different languages, and I think that's part of what these theological rhetorics are trying to help us become aware of. There is ordinary language. If I say, "Would you throw out my coffee when I'm all done?" That's pretty ordinary, right? But then my language constantly changes as I enter into different orders of communication. And so part of the issue is the order and structure of language appropriate to the questions and the issues that you're aiming at. Right? I mean, would a prayer of praise, is that at the human level significant to the God that one is praising? No, you say obviously not, but it's correlated with it, right? It's obviously at a different level, but it's correlated with it. And then you try to find the appropriate order of discourse that would seem to be the most correlated with what you're aiming at. So for the composer of the book of Job, the unanswerable question is the order of discourse that's most appropriate to the unsayability from the human side about most anything, except that these questions turn what we thought was understanding inside out. In other words, so I think it's not, we're obviously stuck within language. Otherwise, the question would simply be, you either have two things you could do if you're a religious person, right? You could be silent through one means or another, or you could be a monk and pray perpetually. But once there are gaps, in other words, between the constancy of verbal awareness of divine otherness, or the incapacity of language to do anything until silence is the only appropriate gesture, then the question is, what is the order of language that's trying to do something? And is there some correlative between the way you structure language and the way you're trying to structure your being? Right? That's part of what the task is. These correlations, whether it's at the ritual level, the liturgical level, you're trying to kind of get into a correlative moment that there is a correlation and it's not so totally off that you are in some kind of correlation with what we're aiming at. I mean, we may be aiming at the wrong thing too, but at least within certain traditions, I would simply say, and then I want to go to the end. I think when any of us, whether you're a pagan or a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim or whatever, when you commit yourself to a tradition and you commit yourself to a particular exegetical form within that tradition, you are making a faith claim. And the faith claim is that will keep me connected to the most truthful things. Right? So I'm not saying that faith is that you have a greater knowledge necessarily. But if I say, I make a commitment to Judaism, and then I make a commitment to a form of rabbinic Judaism, and within rabbinic Judaism to a certain form of interpretation that gives me another frame of explaining things. My faith and my hope is that there'll be more. I'm making a commitment that will at least keep me connected with essential things and not bring me or the world to shame. Right? Right? So the Jewish liturgy using various ways is that there would be, that you won't give birth to Rick, you won't give birth to emptiness, or you won't be ashamed. What else would faith be if it's not? If faith is not propositional, I believe that exists and that is true. If faith is not propositional in a science, so that's faith when it is scientific, right? So it's a proposition, But if faith becomes a commitment to a path, and the trust that path will yield something more truthful than another path, then that becomes a notion of what we call pistis or emunah or faith. That is to say, It's a commitment that over the long haul that the tradition has somehow carved out grooves that would lead to a better sense of holiness or significance, even though lots of people in that tradition can screw it up. But that structures there have possibility. Not that there couldn't be other structures of possibility, but you can't live them all in one lifetime. So then you're making a certain kind. So that will become my transition now to what does Job do with his life? What do you do with that when you want to kind of make some gesture of movement? So he says, Lo eled lebehala, I won't give birth to confusion. Right? What else can a religious person say? I hope that my actions won't give birth to more confusion and stupidity in the world. And that somehow it'll keep me connected to essential things, God, whatever, essential things, and I won't give birth to behalat, stupid confusions, or rik, emptiness. Right? What more can you, I mean, maybe we're speaking as moderns, but I'm talking about ancient liturgy here. Right? So then we see Job makes a second liturgical submission. Right? The first, he made two liturgical claims in chapters 1 and 2. And then he makes a liturgical claim in chapter 40. I'm going to close my mouth. There's nothing I can say. And then he says in 42, and this is where I want to kind of go with the issues that have been raised, and make a suggestion. Some of you have heard a little bit of this before. I'm trying to grow in this, but I'm still the same person. So Job says to God, like, I've heard this. I know that you are omnipotent, verse 2. You can do the kol, you can do the all. Like you can do 19th century totalizing philosophy. You're a superhero. You're a super Hegelian. You can do the all. God can do the all. V'lo yibatzer mimcha mezima. And not only God, can you do the all? But deceit is absent from you. It's a different category. We can't talk about this category of mezima, of like falsehood. Because what would that mean in relationship to what we just heard? We say, God, the geometric stripes on a zebra are wrong. Like you deceive the world. Or animals in the forest can read the stripes of a zebra and they're more likely to be a prey. And if you made the zebras differently, they'd be more invisible. Does that mean that God is acting deceitfully? I mean, really? So he says, things are concealed to my consciousness. So I spoke and I have no sense of the marvelous. That's the new category, of the wondrous, of the numerous, numinous. Velo avin, niflaot mimeni, velo eda. Something is nifla mimeni. The wonder is ever exceeding. It's not just wonder. But wonder is a category that exceeds even comprehension. I have a glimpse of wonder, but wonder can't be limited to the human imagination of nifla, pele, astonishment. Even astonishment is a divine dimension. It's not a category of mind. It's an actuality of divine facticity. Sorry for that term. So if I speak, I have to bear that in mind. And then he says, 5 and 6, I heard about you with the hearing of the ear. Like, there's a rumor of angels. There's a rumor that comes down through tradition. Right? Or I heard things about the word that you proclaimed. Like, I heard rumors of angels. I heard rumors of truth. I heard things.
You read it as tradition, right?
It can be. It can. I don't know. The hearing. I heard you with the hearing of the ear. In other words, if I hear you in an auditory way, I comprehend through the ear. There's a kind of comprehension through the ear. It happens syntactically, sequentially. There's an inner logic to hearing. I can't hear it all at once. Right? But now my eye sees you. So what is he seeing? Okay? What is the seeing that's going on here? Right? Because there is an inner vision of what he has been hearing. I've heard you, maybe now he's saying, I've heard you say this, and now I've seen it, and I have an insight. I don't simply have outsight, I have insight. And if my sight is a different form of understanding, it doesn't have the same syntax as stuff that comes in through my ear. I don't necessarily process it discursively, but my eye can intuit. I see globally. There are two forms of awareness: the ear awareness and knowledge, and the eye awareness and insight. Right? This is as much his inner eye as his outer eye, right? It obviously is his inner eye. It has to be, right? Therefore, now this is his fourth confession. Emas. I despise myself. I have contempt for everything that I had thought. V'nichamti al afar ve'efer. So at the first level, it means I relent or I regret what I said because I am simply dust and ashes. Or I'm sitting in dust and ashes and I realize what my situation is. Right? So that is the standard form of nichamti, as we might say in Genesis 6, where God says, nichamti, I regret that I created man, because the spirit of man is evil all the day, right?
How to read nichamti al-alafa? How to read this?
It's hard. It either means because of, by virtue of the fact that the human being is afar ve'efer, like Abraham is afar ve'efer, dust and ashes, he's mortal, or it means because I'm sitting in dust and ashes, and that is the limit of my capacity. Now, the afar ve'efer becomes the metonym for mortal existence. I'm simply dust and ashes. And being in that situation means that I say two things. Emas, I have to let go and despise all of the claims that I made. Right? There's a letting go and despising myself for the impertinence of speech of a certain type. V'nichamti. Now, if the two verbs are hendaities, they are correlated, then it's a second, it's another dimension of regret, right? But let us just play with the possibility that quite unexpectedly he's alluding to the verb and the noun that appears in the kal form, in a different form of nichama, of compassion. And he's stating this now in a new, more intensified form. And so then he's saying, I now have compassion and sympathy for everything that is merely mortal. That is what makes me different from an ostrich. What makes me different is now I just had an insight about, with the seeing of my inner eye, and I really hate myself for the arrogance of what I said, and so I withdraw from that. And I have a certain, within the framework of nichamti as regret, is a new dimension of compassion for what I am aware of. That all of existence takes place within this field of sorrow. Right? The field of sorrow is the fact that a person is not like a tree and they die. A person tries to speak with integrity. And a person can understand this and have radical compassion for the nature of things, right? This is sort of close to the that great part of Lucretius, right? The lacrimae rerum, the tears of things, the sorrow of existence. It's nifla, it's wondrousness, but this sympathy for people, just the deepening awareness that this puts me in a sympathetic disposition towards existence. Because ostriches are what they are, and monkeys are what they are, and people are what they are. And then, to pick up now on that question, so then God says to Eliphaz, you didn't speak well of me, nechona, like my servant Job. Possibly not alluding to what Job spoke in the earlier cycles, but what he just said. Right? Job was able to have a transformation of his consciousness. If it's what Job said, all the other things, then we have another way of thinking about it. But whatever, God then says, and then he says to Eliphaz, who had been the person who thought he could tell Job what was going on, and Eliphaz was the one who said that a person is not innocent, and Eliphaz was the person who said that he had a divine vision. Eliphaz has theology with a capital T. And he says, so take 7 oxen and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and the two of you raise up a sacrifice ba'adchem, right? That ba'ad links us back to chapter 1, right? The Satan says, or ba'ad or, skin for skin, etc. For the two of you. This word is now coming full circle towards the end.
But not for Elihu.
Yes. For the two of you. And Job, my servant, will pray for you. They're going to do sacrifice. They're going to do it together, ba'adchem, for the two of you. Job will intervene on your behalf. Ki im panav esa, because I have forgiven him. So that, and this will be a forgiveness because you spoke stupidity, nivala, and not nichona. There's a theology of nivala, of stupidity, perversity, and there's a theology of nichona that tries to be upright. And Job got it better than you did. He didn't say that Job knows the truth, but Job spoke nichona, some kind of a positive. So Eliphaz obeys and he goes to his friends as the Lord had commanded, and God forgave Job. He raised up Job's face. He forgave Job. And then God restored things to Job because he prayed ba'ad, against that word ba'ad, right? That was the word that appeared several times in chapters 1 and 2. On behalf of his fellow. So this may help us with how the writer is using this tradition to teach something else. Within the framework of this mysterious theophany, of the mystery of existence, right? All that one can do is withdraw from theology as an idolatry. That you believe in your words as if you're praying to theological concepts. This is a difference between the theological presumptions on earth and what God has just now hinted at. There's a new cesur, a new break that's opening up into consciousness. And the humility of the self that can never be a tree, that's always a self that's going to, at least the self now can have compassion and sympathy for the entire created order because it's stuck in the same slime. It's all coming out of the same humus, out of the same universe. They're just different forms of growth, different levels of consciousness. Even among people, there's some people who speak nivala, stupidity, and there's some people who speak nechona. So you have to have, the new awareness is to be aware of what sympathy means across the board, even to human beings. And then the capacity within the framework of compassion. What do you do with the new awareness to serve God for nothing? Serving God chinam, with no expectation, is simply to serve the world compassionately. And in this first instance, he is told to help be an intercessor for his enemy or for his antagonist. His first task is to join with that person in a religious ritual. He's no longer an other, if we speak in modern terms. He is the same, in the sense that sameness means we're all in the same theological disaster and the same theological hope. So that person is not an other and he has another belief and I'm closer to God in truth, right? But that he's constructed something And even though it's nivala that we're disclosed to here, what Job does is he goes with that person to intercede on his behalf with God, to pray on his behalf, to offer up sacrifices to God's godhood, incomprehensible. And he does it with. We're now in the language of with, not over against. And that's what Job does. And that change of consciousness allows his world to be renewed. The rebirth, the new children and everything that is that the world comes back to him that had been lost by a false consciousness. And the world comes back to him at some level. It comes back to him as small acts of compassion and intervention and care and speaking nechona. Right? So that the language of chapter 1 or even the language of chapter 28 of reverence or turning from evil is now not even itself a theological language. There you're still at the border of theological phrases. But now, theology is totally consciousness and gesture, based on that new theological awareness of what has been revealed to mind. Whether and I want to make two final comments, then open up for the discussion. So then the issue then becomes, that's the new radical awareness of Job as the book of Job. What does it mean then for the book of Job to be placed in the same canon with Genesis 1? Exodus 19 and 20, Sinai. And Deuteronomy 27 and 28, about if you obey my commandments and if you disobey my commandments. So now some discussion.
So you talked a lot about maybe compassion versus something like selfishness. Was that the difference between the second sacrifice and the first sacrifice that he made on behalf of his children, that making a sacrifice on behalf of your children as kind of an extension of yourself, that's not really a compassionate orientation?
Well, he was doing it for utilitarian purposes for himself.
For himself.
Right. He was still serving God for a reason. And I think the writer is saying that at the level of compassion, you get to the ultimate limit that you can get to serve God for no other purpose. Now, as you could say, he's serving God because he despises his presumption. He serves God because of identity with the sorrow of existence. And you could say that there is some explanation, but I think we've pushed. You're at so much at the borderline that to the degree to which you could serve God for no reason. In other words, in a positive religion, you have to say, how far can you go? So if you're in a religion like Buddhism and you talk about shunyata, there's a total emptying. If you talk about certain forms of Hasidic spirituality, that the mind should be mindless like an animal, in other words, it doesn't think. But to the degree to which mind is a thing that you can't get rid of, I have to become aware of other forms of existence. So, in other words, I think it's a receding point of how far you can go not to serve God for any other purpose. Ultimately, we are given an explanation, but it's as far, I think, as you can go in a positive religion that acknowledges mind and otherness and not absolute radical emptying. Then there can be serving God for nothing, but then you have to be at a certain level of ritual mindlessness or mindfulness that's mindless. That's very different. But this tradition doesn't go there, at least this text doesn't go there. Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, they have places where they go there, but not this text. Yeah.
I was going to say, wasn't at the end, isn't he just serving God? He's doing the thing that God tells him to do because God told him to do it, and now he's kind of just this person who is obeying God because God is this all-powerful being who tells him to do a certain thing.
Chinam, because he came to a certain new consciousness. Serving God for no other purpose is because a new consciousnness has transformed him.
And is that new consciousness the Lord saying, do this?
No.
Okay.
It's just this awareness of the excessive distinctiveness of all being, and that everything is a creature in its own way. And compassion is the understanding of being a creature among creatures that are all stumbling to continue their life in some form or another, whether it's for food or simply for explanations. But those are simply forms of perseverance. Right? And to understand that in the most transformative way means that you serve God from the inside out. The notion of what we would now call autonomy or heteronomy doesn't make any sense. If my reading is right, we can't. It's not simply the heteronymous command, and it's not autonomy, but there is some kind of interfusion that's different from the two. I'm not exactly sure how I would call it, but the self is neither a heteronymous or an autonomous self. The self becomes aware of itself as intimately connected with the sorrow and possibilities of existence. And it acts out of this consciousness. And if God gives any command, it's that awareness to consciousness that he has merited. God has been saying that since creation. But it wasn't, Job becomes aware of this for the first time. Or the scripture is the first time it emerges as a spiritual path, as a religious path. It doesn't mean that the place for theological truths and dogmatics and credos, that's why I said people are going to have to try to figure that out. And when we look next time, I think maybe we'll have to see how we want to actually do this today, or just stop with this kind of initial discussion, to move to Maimonides, to move to Cohen, to move to Soloveitchik, to move to Kierkegaard. I think we have to. But what I'm just saying, But what I want to say is, these are attempts now to take it to that other level. I am a Jew. I am a Christian. I am a medieval Jew. I'm a modern Jew. I'm a modern Christian. So how do I go on with that in that context, right? So the history of a community of faith will then want to take that to that next level, right? It does want to take it to that next level. And I don't want to dodge that. I think ultimately a lot of this is work you guys have to do, if you want to, on your own. But we'll see a couple of... What we want to do when we do next time is to kind of figure out what are just like we were trying to figure out with Job, what are his theological presuppositions, and how does he move through and change his presuppositions? Maimonides and Cohen and Soloveitchik and Kierkegaard, they all have certain presuppositions. And then Job is now reintegrated into their normative theological life in a new way. So it doesn't mean that the task goes away. It simply means that the Job now becomes not just a book of wisdom, but becomes a prophecy. In other words, in the context of the canon, Job is not simply a book of wisdom. Job becomes a warner. He doesn't promise the future, but he becomes a reprover. He becomes a reprover of consciousness. So it becomes the genre changes to a prophetic consciousness to prevent you from sliding into backsliding. Right? But that's something that each person's going to have to work out. Let's have some more discussion about. Yeah, please. No, you haven't spoken yet.
So I was thinking about verse 7, the end of 7:42.
Of what chapter?
42.
Verse 7.
Yeah, when God gives Job his approval, and he says, he different from the others. He has spoken the truth, or something like that. I was wondering how to interpret that statement. One very straightforward way to go is just say, oh, God is approving Job's recant, right? That could be, he just say, like he understands now that he was thinking about that in the wrong way. Now, after all his discernment, he got, more or less what's going on here. But I wonder what is the status of all the previous struggle. So because one can say, yeah, he has spoken the truth about God now in 42:5 or something like that. Or one could say the whole process of discernment and struggle, where many things were said about God and not said about God, is part of that truth having spoken.
That would be another way to go about it, and then it would be a confirmation of his struggle for knowledge, but it would also have to include his ability to understand the limits. Right? In other words, if that would be the reading, you'd have to say God is approving that Job didn't deny the authenticity of his understanding and his authentic struggle, and that's part of what the compassion is. That there is a very painful struggle for meaning. But if God is approving of this, he's also realizing that Job has understood that there's a limit at a certain point. And so that is, now what the word nechona in Hebrew means, that you haven't spoken nechona, it's hard to know. It's not simply correctness, like you get it right or you get it wrong. It's also a disposition. So I would say that the closest you can get to that is if you look at Psalm 50, or is it 51? 51, where it says, Leiv tahor v'ruach nachon. Leiv tahor, God, you should create in me a leiv tahor, a pure heart, and a ruach nachon, right? An upright or a proper disposition, a proper spirit. It's something of that notion. It's not nachon as opposed to yes as opposed to false. It's a disposition of something proper. In that context, it's what's proper in terms of integrity, of having a pure heart. Here, it's a certain kind of character trait. It's more of a trait than yes or no. The writer is very sophisticated here.
So would you say that it's saying the friends are being disingenuous? Is that what
Nivala is just being a damn fool. Just being, right? Like, the place where you have that, and I don't necessarily they're alluding to it. Just look at Psalm 14. Amar naval b'libo ein Elohim. The fool says in his heart, "There's no God." So naval is the navala. Is some kind of a jackass. That's what he's saying. The naval, the fool says, "There's no God." Now, having said there's a God, there's a lot of other things that one might be tormented by. But when the psalm, using the translation "fool," I think doesn't really get at the full force of what the psalmist is saying, that the naval says in his mind, his heart. Because the naval thinks that he can really dope it out. He knows what's going on. He can really figure out existence. So navala is the noun of the person who is a naval. It's more than a fool. Nabal, in the narrative, he's a fool. He acts like an idiot, a fool. So this, because he does nivala, right? The nivala comes close to the activity of the people in the Tower of Babel, right? It plays on all of that. There's a kind of cognitive stupidity that's involved in being a naval or nivala. It's not a theological stupidity, it's just a cognitive idiocy, as opposed to some kind of cognitive rightness. But it's not right or right. There's a cognitive rightness, a disposition, and a cognitive stupidity. Finish, and then yeah.
Just to finish the thought, so I guess what I'm trying to get to is like, it seems to me that there is a way to interpret this where we can say that the struggle of faith.
Of faith?
Or the struggle of the believer, the faith.
Yeah, right.
So the struggle itself is a faith of language and a faith of hermeneutic. So the whole process of discernment, where you have many doubts about the meaning of things, the idea of what you can understand, the whole place of God in the cosmos, that whole struggle in itself, I'm just guessing here, and I'm also asking, could be a faithful language and a faithful hermeneutics in the process of doubt and trying to get to the point where...
Yeah, I agree with you, and I would link this issue up with what I said about faith before. If I'm a Jew and you're a Christian and we stand in different places in the tradition, we have a certain faith that the language of our texts can get us somewhere, even through interpretation. If you didn't, give it up. That they're saying something helpful, and where there is confusion, we can reinterpret and bring ourselves to another thing. Ultimately, if that's the hope, that these scriptures, these texts, these liturgies, these interpretations get you farther than you can get than if you were trying to walk in the desert by yourself. Now, this is because they have accumulated a certain wisdom. Now, that means that the worshiper has to figure out the framing of that wisdom that's accumulated, because some of the wisdom is not so, or might have been wise between 1221 and 1222, but it's not wise in 2015. Even though it comes from this, it's drawn from that same source matrix, right? So that's part of what we commit ourselves to do, that those gestures of the generations, those performances, provide a compass. And that the language is a compass, even though you have to constantly recalibrate the language so it aims at the right things. Right? And you have faith that the early formulations of that, whether you believe that they're by tradition or by God or revelation, however you believe that these they guide consciousness hermeneutically. So hermeneutical theology means that it's not just there once and for all, because our consciousness keeps changing. And we have trust that our traditions can help us reformulate that based on that foundation of language, which includes what the faith was, but it's not so simple. It has to be constantly, so that's where all the theological fights take place. Right? I can interpret better than you, and I really know how to make this work and what the real intention was, right? Rather than a deeper sympathy. But Job puts us into a very hard situation, even with that awareness. You see that what is the new foundation? The new foundation is consciousness, a sympathetic consciousness. What is that foundation, right? And so it puts us in just think about our situation, right? Where people can't even, the notion of the face of another religion or another person can't easily be trusted. You look at one face and you say, maybe there's a Nazi lurking under that face. It looks like a human face, but it's a Nazi. Or if you're walking in Paris, say, well, it looks like a human face, and I want to be sympathetic, but maybe it's a person who wants to blow themselves up. In other words, we're faced with kind of issues of, I believe that Job has given us a very fundamental new awareness, but it doesn't eliminate that problem between sympathy and who is your neighbor and who is an other. Because we are now, the horror of our situation this century is this radical doubt and suspicion at every level. That's the horror of what terrorism has done. It's made one suspicious of helping another person, and we're facing even with the issue with the issue with the migrants, the suspicion of care. So what's being revealed is a great revelation of sympathetic concern, and we're still faced with the difficulty of going on with what it means to be a human being in all kinds of complicated situations. That's more of a, if you have to go, it's fine. It's fine. Adrian, if you have to go, yeah. I know you have to teach, so yeah. So it's complicated, as you see. There's a foundation, and there's a lack of foundation, because there's nothing absolutely clear, right? Right. So if you retranslate this back into scriptural terms, we're faced with a conundrum. Love your neighbor like yourself, but is the neighbor like myself? How is the neighbor like myself? So the text is saying one way to construe that. He is like you in these kinds of ways. And then you wonder, is he really like me? And can I trust? So how you move forward, even with a Jobian theology of care, doesn't get rid of some very hard ethical gestures. I'm not trying to deny that the legal and the theological task is extraordinary. But to some degree, what's revealed to our consciousness is something that precedes legal norms. There's something ultimately there's something normative, but there's a disposition that is now addressed to us that may be addressed to an orientation that ideally precedes norms. then there's norms, and then there are laws, right? So there's a disposition, there are dispositions, then there are norms, normative orientations, normative actions, then there are laws, right? And there's a whole spectrum across that, where, right? I think that the book of Job is trying to get us to a disposition towards a certain way of living, a kind of normativity from the base of the disposition, whether that can underpin a certain kind of legality, whether a religious or a secular, civil, is a different question. One would that's a question to be thought through, or what is to be cultivated in the heart of a person for civilization to go on, right? So nothing is easy, and my interpretation of the text itself is not absolutely foolproof, right? I'm obviously projecting a certain kind of hermeneutical will upon the text too. I could have even interpreted lots of other ways too, but that's part of interpreting within our horizon of concerns. The text may have many other ways, and as we'll see next time, when we deal with the rabbinic or certain parts of the Christian tradition, that horizon changes. And it may be a better Job, or may be a worse interpretation of Job. So what I would suggest, I just don't know what to suggest. Let's do that next time. It probably doesn't make sense to then also try to do sacred attunement at that point. But I may try to give, if we have time, towards the end, some preliminary statements about the task of theology. So if you do have the time, go back to at least the first part of the sacred attunement. I will spend time trying to unpack, but since that opening part is the way to theology, I think we then have to say, how do you then step forward with all the risk that is required, that you have the scriptures, you have a history of tradition, and then you have to step forward to make your own statements about all of that, right? So I think I'd like to come towards that, but really more to open up that path forward. So we're starting with a fundamental scripture which has hermeneutical theology in it in different ways, and it's already raising all the complicated issues of interpretation, life, evaluation, evil, judgment. Then we're going to take a look at move a little bit through the tradition, and then we have to say, well, with that in both hands, scripture and tradition, then how do you move forward towards theology that way? So, see ya.